Okay, welcome everyone to our talk today, hosted by FIONN Bows-FITZPATRIck on communication of climate crises. I'd like to welcome you all, and I will hand the mic to you, Fionn. So good luck, and we'll have questions at the end. Thank you very
Short,
much.
sweet, and to the point. Thank you very much. Thank you, Oscar. Oscar or Kieran, which would you prefer?
I tend to use Oscar for acting, so that
Okay,
that's just
Kieran
to keep things,
then.
just to keep my two lives separate. But
Excellent.
yes, Kieran works perfectly.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Kieran. Hello, everybody. Hope you're all keeping well, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. So, as Kieran introduced me there, my name is FIONN Bows-FITZPATRIck, and yeah, today I'm going to be giving you all a brief presentation on, I suppose, my area of interest. I will not say expertise because that would be a completely inaccurate statement. But my area of interest when it comes to climate change, which is in relation to how we talk about it. So, a little bit about my background, I suppose, to start off. As I said, my name is Fionn. I have a background in media. I work part-time anyway as a photographer and filmmaker. And I suppose from a very, very young age, my real area of interest has been storytelling, communication, how we talk to one another about the issues that affect our lives. And as as I'm sure you're all well aware, um, currently, I suppose the issue that really, really affects us the most is the climate crisis, and it's the one that's probably the most complex, really. So that is what I have spent the last couple of years really focusing on as a storyteller, in my writing, in my photography and filmmaking. Um, I graduated from the Technological University of Dublin, TU Dublin, Grange Gorman in 2022 with a degree in film and broadcasting. Around the same time, I served as a climate ambassador with Antashka and spent a little bit of time working with Antashka as a social media content creator, after graduation. Um, so my dissertation was pretty much pretty much it feeds into today's presentation. The title of it was A Crisis of Communication: What Media Gets Wrong About Climate Change and How to Set It Right. So this presentation today and what I'll be talking about is pretty much a summation of the main points that I kind of came to, main points I concluded in that research. Um, Now, there will be a little bit of room for questions and further points towards the end. And I assure you, I will be going on a couple of tangents throughout, simply because this was a short 2.5 years ago, but I think we can all agree a heck of a lot has happened within the 2.5 years since I originally conducted this research. So I would have a lot more to say about it, a lot more to expand on it than I had initially. So, without any further ado, we'll press on. So, I guess the first thing we really need to understand, when it comes to climate change, is this idea of the hyper object. This is really sort of to explain why I've decided to focus on this one particular um, section. So, the philosopher Timothy Morton has described the climate crisis as a hyper object. So essentially, it is a hyper object is something that is so grand, so complex, just so all encompassing of every single aspect of our society, of our day-to-day lives, that it basically blends into the background. I'm sure you're all aware of the old joke about what do fish talk about? Well, I don't know, but you can be sure as hell it's not water. You know, climate change is to us at this point basically what water is to a fish. It is such an all-encompassing issue that has its tentacles in has both its roots and its tentacles in every aspect of our society, our economy, our culture, and that's a very overwhelming thing. It's a really overwhelming thing to try and come to terms with, let alone try to actually tackle. And so I think really that is one of the fundamental. This is kind of the root reason why climate change is something that is so very, very difficult for any of us to fully deal with and comprehend, especially in a media setting. It has been suggested by many that our current media systems are just systematically ill-equipped to help us understand and tackle these kinds of hyper objects. So it's a daunting task we've really set ourselves. So my approach really when it comes to something, my advice to anyone, as someone who's been somewhat involved with climate activism to one extent or another over the last couple of years, is to focus in on an area, a specific subset that you can make a difference in. So, you see here on screen, we have I assume we all know what these are. These are the UN Sustainable Development Goals, as they currently stand. When I was growing up, I believe there were 15 of them. That's now been expanded to 17. The thing I love about the UN Sustainable Development Goals is that they break everything down into 17 manageable subsections. Okay, so if we want to create a more sustainable and just world going into the future, that is a big, where do you even start, you know? I mean, I have certainly felt it a lot myself, you know, oh, I'm too small. What kind of difference can I make? I'm sure everyone here has probably felt that to one extent or another in their lives. So what I love about the Sustainable Development Goals is that they break down into manageable subsections, areas of expertise, of experience, of interest through which you can approach such a thing, begin to approach such a daunting task, and really focus in on an area that really, really interests you. Just picking one of these, for example, another big area of interest for me is sustainable cities and communities. Myself and Kieran were talking about it just before you all joined us. The absolute nightmare that is commuting in Dublin. So it's something that's kind of quite dear to my heart. I'm sure it's quite dear to a lot of people's hearts in this audience. So, you know, that is one area through which you can approach this. And, you know, affect change in that area that you personally feel you can affect some level of change. And that's if we can all just do that, the collective effort of that adds up to something bigger. At least, I suppose that's the idea, that's the hope. So yeah, on that note, that is basically the reason why I have decided to focus in on media and storytelling, I'm gonna say. Here we introduce another key term, strategic narratives. Okay, so I have a quote here from Yuval Noah Harari in his excellent book, Sapiens. I'm sure many of you have read it. Large numbers of strangers can cooperate successfully by believing in common myths. Any large-scale human cooperation, whether in a modern state, a medieval church, an ancient city, or an archaic tribe, is rooted in common myths that exist only in people's collective imagination. I remember reading this quote a couple of years ago and just thinking to myself, gosh, that it just puts everything into quite sharp perspective, I suppose. At least for me anyway, for someone with a passion for communication and narrative storytelling. You know, I suppose for a lot of us creatives, there can sometimes be the sense that what we do is really quite frivolous in in the face of the challenges we are experiencing now in the modern world. Climate change being the big overarching one, but I mean, I think I forget who the phrase is attributed to, but another key phrase that isn't mentioned in this presentation, but I think we ought to keep in mind is the poly crisis. You know, um, so it can feel very overwhelming. But ultimately, what are humans but storytelling machines? That is essentially how we understand the world and how we have always really understood the world. It is by telling ourselves tales and stories, taking elements of the truth, but presenting them in such a way that they're easier to understand and occasionally using, metaphor or analogy that we can come that is how we communicate with not only one another and cooperate in a society, but how we understand our place in the world. So Naomi Klein, of course, expresses very similar views in her book, This Changes Everything, arguing that emerging realities of climate change really expose the foundational myth that we have been following for the last couple of centuries, at least, to really be very delusional. You'll see here the image I have is goodness, pardon me, I forget the name of the artist, but it is a painting from 1872, I believe, um, showing a kind of a mythologized metaphorical expansion of settling into the New West in North America. So we have the pioneers here being led further and further into the vast unknown of the American West by this kind of guiding angel of liberty and progress and what technology and what have you. Um, it's a very, very evocative image that, for many, embodies this sort of foundational myth, especially in North America, but I think to a very large extent, you can see that as a continuation of the foundational myth that we have had in, for lack of a better term, as a fraught term, rightfully, but the Western world over the last couple of centuries, at least since the fall of feudalism at the very end of the Middle Ages and the birth of modern capitalism in the early modern period of the 1500s, thereabouts. This idea that progress, that continuously moving forward, ever expanding um, into into previously, well, undiscovered by Westerners anyway, lands, grabbing the resources, using those resources to generate them into capital and generating wealth, developing those regions, so to speak, by basically destroying the lives of the native inhabitants, by destroying the nature and the ecosystem therein. To whether we realize it or not, I think that really has been the defining narrative of North America and European societies anyway over the last couple of centuries. And look where that's gotten us. Look where that's gotten us. Perhaps we should have seen it coming, really, when the story that we tell ourselves about what it means for what positive change is continuously destroying our planet for our own short-term selfish gain. Well, I mean, that's when you look at it that way, the situation we find ourselves in today seems pretty much inevitable. So the main thing I think one of the main challenges anyway, we really, really need to ask ourselves as a society, as activists, especially people who are interested in making a positive change, is what is the story we want to tell ourselves now in the 21st century? What is a more compelling narrative to supplant that of expansionism and colonialism and capitalism and ultimately environmental destruction as the end result of that? What do we want to replace that with? So, this idea of constructing a new strategic narrative for tackling the climate crisis is really the main thing I wanted to focus on. And in my research, in my dissertation, I came up with these seven general guidelines. Obviously, they're not by no means expansive. There is a heck of a lot of room for further development and discussion. I hope that at the very end we can have more of an open discussion about this. And it's, again, a hyper object, a polycrisis like the climate crisis that has its roots in everything, has its tentacles in everything. Everything needs to change in order to tackle it to one extent or another. So, with that nuance out of the way, I suppose, we can focus in on these 7 points specifically just for constructing the kind of strategic narrative that I think we really need to start telling ourselves, that we really need to start building society around into the 21st century.
Oh yeah, this is thanks very much.
Hello.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, so moving swiftly along, I suppose. I've waffled long enough for that introduction, I think. So the first point in these 7 points is bridging the gap. Specifically, bridging the gap between science and everyday life. So one of my personal heroes and the science communicator and astronomer Carl Sagan spoke about this back in the 1990s, and he put it very, very succinctly. I'll just read out this quote here, I suppose. We've arranged a global civilization in which the most crucial elements, transportation, communications, and all other industries, agriculture, medicine, education, entertainment, protecting the environment, and even the key democratic institution of voting profoundly depend on science and technology. And yet, we have also arranged things so that almost no one understands science and technology. This is a prescription for disaster. I can attest. I am the very kind of person that I think Carl Sagan was warning about all the way back in 1995. I am very much a layman when it comes to most things scientific. The vast, vast majority of people are, and understandably, it's completely unreasonable, unrealistic to expect that everyone has a PhD level understanding in every field there is. But yet, even with that in mind, one cannot help but be concerned by the sheer level of scientific illiteracy and, I suppose, lack of willingness to understand that seems to be rife in the modern world. We see this with, I think, two things over the last couple of years have really, really pronounced this issue. That being medicine and climate change, of course. So climate change, I'll be elaborating on a heck of a lot more throughout this presentation. But even just thinking back to COVID, we saw a huge surge in anti-vaccination, anti-modern medicine sentiments. It's a very large and nuanced topic for sure, but I think it really has brought to the forefront that so many of us just completely willingly are ignorant of basic basic reality and expertise and research. And and taking this back to climate change, this whole phenomena of 97, I believe now it's 99% of all scientific authorities now agree that climate change is happening. It is caused by humans, by human activity. Most of the most severe weather catastrophes, climate extreme weather events we're experiencing are as a result of it. And yet, a significant subset of society is still going to continuously say, "Oh no, they're wrong. No, 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 no. This 1% of scientists who are, when you look into it, are almost all just paid and funded by fossil fuel lobbyists. Oh no, they're right." You know, um, just a very recent example, I suppose, with the LA wildfires that happened just last month. Those happened. I mean, how we're kidding ourselves if we're going to say, "Oh, that wasn't a result of climate change." What the hell do you mean? I mean, these extreme weather events, these wildfires, these dry conditions are happening at a far more frequent and widespread rate than they ever did in decades past. But yet you're going to tell me, "Oh, no, it's all oh, it's some conspiracy. It was started by, I don't know, isn't one of the big ones going around that homeless people started the fire or some nonsense? Oh, it's because of DEI, it's because of diversity." They'll blame anything under the bloody sun except for the actual scientific realities of the climate crisis. And that's a real challenge. But look, I think what it ultimately comes down to is science communicators. Science is Science can be very, very difficult to communicate in a way that's engaging and understandable to the vast majority of people. So, um, that is really the point we're getting at with this first point, anyway, is that media practitioners, news media, tend to have a very, very low level of scientific understanding. And scientists tend to have very, very poor media literacy skills. I really think that going forward, we need a heck of a lot more um, scientific minds like Dr. Carl Sagan, who, as well as being experts in their fields, are able to communicate that expertise in a way that is engaging, is understandable, is digestible to the vast majority of people. So moving on to point two, I suppose. Next thing we really have to do is bridging the gap between the human and natural worlds. So I think this is a large part of our prevailing myth of the past couple of centuries. That being, humanity and nature are two completely separate things. Progress is when humanity overcomes and subsues nature. Um, so I think that really feeds into this prevailing issue that we're seeing a lot now, where climate change is seen as very much a niche concern, And you can understand that to a large extent because undeniably things like growing inequality, cost of living, corruption, war, displacement, terrorism, pandemics, genocide, these are all very real concerns we are dealing with every single day in the modern world. And with all this going on, it's very, very difficult to really give much thought to the climate crisis. And look, I am very much guilty of this myself over the last couple of years. I haven't been nearly as involved with a climate activism as I was just a couple of years ago. And that's because so many different crises, like the ones listed here and many, many more, are subsuming our consciousness. Um, Understandably, take higher priority. But I think what we really need to understand, again, is that climate change is at the root of all of it, really. Therefore, acknowledging and understanding the connection between climate change and other human and social justice issues is critical. Um, and I mean, this is really kind of this is sort of the main theory behind climate justice and this growingly popular notion of a just transition. That the world is in a terrible state as it is, with or without climate change. So any real narrative, any real strategy to effectively combat and tackle climate change needs to also address and tackle all these other issues: inequality, cost of living, corruption, war, displacement, genocide, pandemics. Every single one of them is only going to be exacerbated by the climate crisis. And so that's the bad news. But I suppose the more sobering thing is that this does present an opportunity. We need to fix the climate crisis. That's not debatable. It is imperative that we do it. We have already exceeded our 1.5 degrees of warming set by the Paris Agreement of 2015. Um, we need to take action on this fast. The good news is that we can also, if we play our cards right, use this as a good opportunity to improve all these other things and improve life for everyone. We need to understand that human well-being and protecting the climate are not these two divided, completely mutually exclusive things. Increasingly, they're intertwined, they're interlocked. Um, and I think maybe I'm just a little bit optimistic in that regard, but I do think that we're seeing this a little bit more, and there is a little bit of historical precedent. So I learned today that this week a little bit about the Great Stink in London of, oh goodness, that says 1958. It should be 1858. My apologies, typo. But anyway, 1858, in London, they were in the midst of a severe cholera pandemic, and environmental catastrophe. Centuries of people pooing into the Thames River, using it as an open sewer, essentially, was coming back to bite them. That, combined with the hot summer weather, created an absolute cesspool, essentially. Causing not only a foul, unpleasant odor, but all sorts of disease and illness and death. This finally became an issue when it affected those with the power to change it. So, where is the British Parliament? It's in Westminster, right? Westminster Palace. Where is Westminster Palace? Right beside the Thames. So it was really only when the stink got so bad that the British government could no longer ignore it, that it was really hitting them where it hurts, that they finally decided, okay, we seriously need to take some action on this. Cleaner, more sustainable waste management. Of course, Dr. Faraday, this led to I suppose, the breakthrough to the discovery of germ theory as we know it today, and the foundation of so much of modern medicine, so much of modern science. So it ended up being a great opportunity, but only after it really started to hit people where it hurts. And look, perhaps I'm being overly optimistic. Time will tell. I just have to hope that we are, as a global society, beginning to realize how much this affects us all. In the background here, of course, we have a very recent picture from the LA wildfires. And I would, I hope, I have to hope that this will be something of a wake up, that for Western governments, for Western society, that this isn't something that is completely separate from us or down the road, or this is just polar bears drowning in the Atlantic or whatever, or this is only something that affects people in the developing world, as if that would make it any better. It doesn't. Um, but we can no longer just kind of use those excuses, which we might have back in the day, because as we can see here, one of the world's major cities, Los Angeles, completely engulfed in flames, whole neighborhoods destroyed. This is climate change in action. It is hitting all of us, one way or the other. It's only a matter of time. Now that we can see it and that it's undeniable, hopefully, I hope we're going to finally take action. Right, so point number three, in constructing effective media narratives is one has to know their audience. So I suppose this is kind of similar to this leads on from the idea of framing narratives around how interconnected climate catastrophe is with human interests. When constructing any kind of a narrative, any story around climate change, one has to have in mind a sense of who you're talking to, who you're appealing to, what issues affect them, and how that ties into climate change. So narratives should ideally be crafted to resonate with the intended audiences, appealing to their lived experiences and values. It can be difficult for an audience to engage with issues that seem abstract or irrelevant to them personally. So, to engage with society in tackling the climate crisis, the causes, consequences, and issues must be made clear. To show an example, I suppose, from the last 20 years or so, in the background, I have an image from an episode of the television program South Park, which, oh, I have such a love-hate relationship with that show. Oh, it can be funny sometimes, but oh God, some of their political and social takes can be dreadful. This episode being one such example, in which they basically take the piss out of former US vice president and presidential nominee and turned climate change spokesperson Al Gore. They make fun of him. Oh, he's this buffoon. He's talking about some mythological monster that doesn't exist and how it's all coming to get you and all this ridiculous stuff. I obviously that's absurd and it's a rather shameful misinformation. But I do think there is a point to be made about someone like Gore, a very wealthy, influential political figure, um, being this sort of face spokesperson for this movement for such a long time. I think for many, many people, most people, that's pretty alienating to a large extent. By contrast, someone like Greta Thunberg more recently, who came at this from a much more a far less prominent position. Someone who was just a teenager, just a schoolgirl, someone I think we can all at one point in our lives relate to. Just a regular, everyday young citizen who was concerned about climate change, who was well informed of the reality, of the scientific reality of it, probably more than most people, but still came at it from that very humble, very normal perspective. Um, I think that kind of a message resonates so much more effectively with people than just it being politicians or celebrities at the Oscars, say, flying around in their private jets. That level of hypocrisy, I think to a large extent, it's maybe a little overstated, but there is a point there. So knowing your audience and being able to relate to the people you're talking to is crucial. In doing so, I think there is an imperative to balance optimism and despair, right? So some argue, rightfully so, I think, that the widespread overwhelm, nihilism, and apathy that many feel around climate change may now hinder progress as much as ignorance or denial ever did. It strikes me about 10 years ago, you had many, many people who would deny climate change was happening at all. Oh, it's the globe is all the climate's always been changing. Oh, maybe it is happening, but it's not being caused by humans, blah, blah, blah. The good news is that I don't see that nearly as much anymore, at least not in places of power or authority. What you do see increasingly, though, is people saying, oh, well, look, climate change is happening. It is being caused by humans. It is terrible, but there's nothing we can do. We might as well just surrender ourselves to the nihilism, the hopelessness. Oh, there's nothing we can do about it. No, 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 no. That has the exact same end result as doing nothing at all. Right? So ideally, narratives should balance an honest picture of the scientific reality, what is at stake, the social reality, while also providing an overview and understanding of what solutions are available. Briefly here, I have this graph of the projected healing of the ozone layer, right? So whatever happened to the ozone layer, right? We don't hear about that nearly as much as we did, certainly not when I was in school about 15, 20 years ago. And less so less so decades ago when back in the 70s, when we really started to understand that CFC gases were posing a real threat to the ozone layer. The reason why we don't hear about it nearly as much is that is getting better. We still have a good way to go. You can see here in 2017, it's still quite a significant gap, but it has been gradually shrinking and is continuing to shrink and is on course to heal completely by 2065, according to some data. Anyway, UN, I think this is from. Yes. That is because of the Montreal Accord from 1988. World governments realized, oh dear, we have a serious problem in our hands. We need to come together with bilateral solutions to limit the use of CFC gases in everyday products in order to save the ozone layer. And in a rare, refreshing turn, it actually seems to be working so far. So that's one area where we can actually look to with some optimism. We have some precedent of bilateral international cooperation working to tackle an existential crisis we all face. On that note, we have to balance individual and collective action. So there is a tension between narratives which focus too heavily on individual action and those focusing on collective responsibility. So I think we see it a lot in Irish discourse around climate change, especially, where I think so much of the onus, so much of the focus is placed on individual actions. Oh, more people need to recycle more. Oh, people need to drive less. Oh, people need to ditch the car, take the bikes, for example. And that's a whole another discussion, an important one. But it is very, very important to a large extent that we all take action, individual responsibility. But we also have to be realistic in understanding that it's not everyday Joe Soaps who are at the root of it all. It is a small percentage of the most wealthy and powerful fossil fuel tech corporations and politicians around the world who are letting them get away with pretty much unfiltered, unmitigated devastation and catastrophe. Now, again, though, similar to my previous point about optimism versus despair, I think you can also fall into the trap of saying, oh, well, this other entity, governments, big businesses, they're not going to make a change, so why the hell should I? On a slightly bigger scale, I think, again, we see this a lot in Ireland, where so much of the discourse around Ireland doing its part to tackle the climate crisis is, oh, well, sure, even if we do something, China isn't going to do anything. If China isn't going to reduce their emissions, why the hell should Ireland? that is a very, very defeatist attitude, I think. So it's a delicate balance, and I would welcome any further discussion on how we can get that right, but it is a balancing act. The former, we talk individual action, it just places too much blame on the smaller issues, the away from the root causes, the seismic political and economic culprits. But then focusing too much on that can leave people demoralized and apathetic. Um, so I'd welcome any further discussion on that, but moving swiftly along because we're running a little low on time. My goodness. Another thing we need to do is redefining the good life. This is something I think we alluded to a little bit earlier in this discussion that inevitably life in the developed world, the so-called developed world anyway, will have to change substantially to mitigate climate change's worst effects. But this doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. It absolutely can be a bad thing, and one of my big criticisms, I suppose, of more climate conscious governments around the world is that, to a large extent, a lot of climate action to date has taken very much an austerity approach, hurting everyday people, where it hurts without focusing enough of the blame on and enough of the responsibility on the big systematic factors. But if done right, it can really be used to make life better for most of us, for everyone, really. I mean, I suppose as someone who has relatively recently entered the workforce, this is something that has been on my mind a lot. How good is life in the developed, wealthy, prosperous Western world? How good is, Ireland is one of the wealthiest nations on earth, at least on paper. And yet we see we have some of the worst um, in social inequality in the high OECD world. Such a severe homelessness crisis, housing crisis, um, mental health is across the developed world has been on a downward trend. And I use this scene here from the TV show SpongeBob SquarePants, a children's show with a lot of very pointed and profound commentary on the realities of modern adult life, which I think just embodies this crisis so very well. I'm not sure if you were to ask the vast majority of people, how good is life in the modern world, really? And how could we make it better? How could we use the necessity to change to help the climate? How can we spin that to also, while we're at it, improving issues like housing, like social inequality, like mental health, the mental health crisis we're facing, the health crisis. There's so much scope and potential, and I think that's really how we have to approach this. It's a point I've continuously come back to, and I think if there's one thing I want you to all take away from this evening, it is that we really need to drive home this idea that the climate crisis, it's horrific, but if we play our cards right, it could be an opportunity. It could be an exciting opportunity to mend so much of what is wrong with the modern world and create a better life for us all. There's a lot more nuance there. I'd like to discuss it if we had more time. Maybe at the very end we can discuss this a bit more, but moving on. Final point is the co-creation of narratives. So this kind of harkens back to a lot of what we have discussed within the last half hour or so, that polarization really plagues media narratives around climate change. So for this reason, the group Climate Outreach suggests that media practitioners, that communicators really need to facilitate what they term a co-creation of narratives between citizens, experts, and policymakers. Um, An informed public dialogue around the solutions can co-create narratives which provide our best hope for tackling the crisis in as democratic and just a way as possible. I think really this kind of just puts a cap on everything else we've discussed, the previous 6 points. Um, in order to craft effective narratives around the climate crisis and create hope for something better to come out of it, we're all in this together. To borrow that admittedly somewhat cheesy term from the COVID crisis. I think that's the kind of energy, that's the kind of mindset we really need to go forward into the future with when it comes to climate change. I think the general public, policymakers need to listen to and understand scientists, understand the material facts and realities. And policymakers then need to listen to people, understand what needs to change on a societal level as well as an environmental level, and triangulate those all these needs into creating a better, more just, more sustainable society for us all. So those are the 7 points, really. I suppose, yeah, before we open the floor out to discussion, final points we need to make here is that as I've said, this is a very broad generalization. There's really only so much we can cover in the relatively short format of this lecture series. But really, strategic narratives on their own are not enough to solve the climate crisis. Really, this is a fight for our lives that encompasses everything. As I said before, climate change, it has its roots in almost every single aspect of modern society and policy and economy and life and culture, economy especially. But it also has its tentacles kind of going back into those things, kind of tearing them apart from within. Um, Ultimately, strategic narratives are only part of the much wider jigsaw puzzle that is creating greater awareness and consciousness and urgency around the climate crisis and fixing it. To supplement that, I would say the two most important things we really need to focus on over the coming years. One is education. I believed it when I was in school myself, and in the years since, I've only grown more and more convinced of it. The current education system, primary, secondary, and third level, just completely ill-equipped to tackle the multitude of crises, not least of which the climate crisis, that we face in the modern world. And so we need fundamental reform in that area. Part two, and look, this is controversial, but I think less so as time goes on. Neoliberal capitalism. Oh, sorry, there is someone about to say something? I'm going to wrap it up now anyway. And then we'll open up to the floor with whatever time we have left. Capitalism as it exists today is pretty much at the root of all of this. This neoliberal idea that what's good for the wealthy, that is good for society. That if government just leaves the market, leaves businesses to do their thing, get as wealthy as possible, that is ultimately going to trickle down and benefit everyone in society. We have been experimenting with this for 40, 50 years. I think it is beyond clear at this point that the experiment has failed. It has led to corporations running absolutely rampant, destroying our planet for their own short-term gain. What's the better alternative? That's a very nuanced discussion. It's too nuanced for this particular short form discussion, but it is absolutely possible. A final quote I just want to leave us here with is from the late great science fiction author Ursula K. Le Guin, who said shortly before her death in 2018, "We live in capitalism." We can substitute the word capitalism for, say, climate change, unmitigated, unfettered climate change. we live in the current epoch we live in, essentially. Its power seems inescapable, but so did the divine right of kings in the medieval period. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, often begin in storytelling, and very often in our art, in the art of words. With that, I'd like to thank you all very much for listening to me ramble, and now I'd like to open it up to the floor.
Uh, Thank you very, very much, Fionn. That was really, really thought-provoking. It's nice. What I really enjoy with these talks is there's such a really wide variety of topics. We've had really interesting talks on, we had very specific kind of numbers-based one on bees before. We've done pocket gardens, which are sort of, and we have like really nice philosophical ones. So just in general, something I really enjoy about these talks is the really wide variety of different approaches that people can take. So thank you very much for that talk. I will now stop the recording so that people feel comfortable coming forward with questions. So thanks again, Fionn.
You're welcome. You're welcome, Oscar. And as I said, as Oscar said very, very rightfully, and this is another point we need to drive home continuously, it's an everything crisis. So we need solutions from every aspect